All right. So now we're getting to that story I brought up earlier about the formation of a second united front. Remember, the first united front between the Chinese nationalists and the Chinese communists was one that was engineered, encouraged, and really foisted upon these two parties by way of the of communist Russia, and ended with the White Terror in 1927. The Second United Front will not be because of foreign intervention, but rather uh, domestic anti-Japanese sentiment, a growing sentiment and a growing concern by many that rather than engage in civil war, i.e., Chinese killing Chinese, Chinese nationalists killing Chinese communists, we need to join forces, as rickety as such an alliance might be, to confront the unquestioned threat to China, i.e., Japan, especially having seen the invasion of Manchuria and the formation of Manchukuo. So this brings us back to something that we actually spoke about last week, and now we have a chance. Now you have a chance to know that these are simultaneous. So the encirclement campaigns, Chiang Kai-shek's attempt to destroy the Jiangxi Soviet base area, was both before and after Japan's invasion and occupation of northeast China. And there, a variety of factors here. One of them being that, according to most accounts, Chiang Kai-shek truly believed that Chinese communism was a greater threat to China than Japanese imperialism, and that internal, or you could also say that internal unification and destruction of internal domestic enemies was a prerequisite to any kind of action against Japan. And regardless of whether or not that's sound judgment, it really pissed off a lot of people because if you see this kind of military capacity thrown at the destruction of other Chinese nationals, the question naturally emerges for some: what if this were directed against Japan, or at least the protection of Chinese sovereignty against Japanese aggression? What might that look like? Chiang Kai-shek's commitment to the destruction of the communists was really sincere, really heartfelt, and that even in the wake of the Long March, which we talked about last week, this 5,600-mile march, that the new plan after the destruction of the Jiangxi Soviet base area, the new goal was the destruction of the Yan'an base area. I mean, this is like, the Matrix trying to destroy Neo. It's like, whatever. This is the sense that this is the end. We have to destroy this contingent, no matter how embattled and how weakened they are. And it's not even a year before a new plan is hatched. And one particular military officer, Zhang Xueliang, is tasked with um, leading this new assault on the Chinese communist base area in Yan'an. And he drags his feet. He does not take action. Zhang Xueliang his personal story matters a great deal here. He is the son of a man named Zhang Zuolin, who was a kind of more or less former warlord in Manchuria, who, when this man Zhang Zuolin, this man's father, ran afoul of Japanese militarists and basically kind of stood in the way of Japanese objectives in the region of northeast China, that Japanese militarists had his father assassinated. His train car was detonated, and he eventually died of his wounds. And Zhang Zuiliang is the son of a man that was killed by Japanese militarists. So there is a personal story here as well as to why he might be so concerned about why are we engaged in civil war when we have this growing threat to our northeast. Chiang Kai-shek flies personally to Xi'an in order to more or less compel Jiang to follow orders. I mean, he was being in essence insubordinate, and instead of acquiescing, Jiang Suiliang engineers the kidnapping, the taking hostage of the president of China. So he is held against his will, and during that time, he is met with a number of kind of interlocutors, and one of them is Zhou Enlai, that Zhou Enlai, who, upon hearing the story of this, the Chinese communists dispatched Zhou Enlai from Yan'an to meet. What transpired in these meetings is the subject of a lot of debate, and sort of the records are very hazy. But what we know is that following this 2 week abduction, that Chiang Kai-shek is released on Christmas Day. Chiang Kai-shek is a Christian, so there's some sort of symbolism to that. Whether he was released on Christmas Day. He contends that no deals were made. Jiang Suiliang immediately after doing this, immediately surrenders to Chiang Kai-shek and is placed under arrest, and will stay under house arrest for basically the remainder of his life. But what we know is that following this, military aggression against the Yan'an base area ceases, and we have the beginning of what is known as this, is typically referred to as the Second United Front. And this United Front, the first United Front was for the purposes of reuniting China during the warlord period. The Second United Front is about confronting Japan. Now think of it. If the first United Front and the formation of a unified government of China, however weak, however sort of, however many problems it had, if that was enough to scare Japanese militarists into accelerating their plans of invasion, of conquest, of growth in China, imagine the concerns that would have been felt by Japanese militarists and war hawks at news of a political alliance between hardened enemies, Chinese communists, Chinese nationalists, for the purposes of confronting Japan. That is to say, it is not a coincidence that this is 1936 and 1937 is the beginning of the war. It's not inevitable, but it is there. When people see this in Japan, this is a cause of concern, because again, we're facing a more unified, popularly nationalist foe, and that's going to make our objectives in China all the more difficult. Okay, so this brings us to the outbreak of war, the formal understanding of where war breaks out, and this is what the map will eventually look like, but this is not where the map begins. So I just want to point out some things that, of course, Manchuria up here, I think you can see my cursor. That's already under Japanese control, all the way to really the Great Wall is already under Japanese control. Taiwan is part of the Japanese Empire. Korea is part of the Japanese Empire. So there is, I mean, I'm no military military strategist, but this is a profoundly advantageous sort of set of positions from which to engage militarily with the mainland. There are multiple ways here, and of course Japan boasts a very strong navy. It has a sort of well, within East Asia, a dominant air superiority, and it has a massive military branch of its military in northeast China, just across the Great Wall from Beijing. So this is what it's going to look like, but this is not how it starts out. So let's go back in time a little bit. This is the Marco Polo Bridge incident. This is one of these moments in time that is just so, it would be absurd were it not the beginning of such darkness. But this is one of the preeminent historians of Japan, a quote from one of his books. A Japanese soldier was missing from his formation. His commanders demanded the right to search the area, and Chinese countered with a proposal for a joint search. By the time the soldier returned, basically from taking a piss, small scale violence had broken out. Hardly, one might think, an event that could lead to years of battle and millions of casualties, but it marked the beginning of the China War. Now, so there's this small scale altercation, and at the outset, uh, order is restored. This does not lead immediately to the outbreak of large scale war, but there were among especially Japanese military circles a debate about what was the meaning of this. And in essence, there were some that saw this as excuse enough, reason enough for the expansion of Japanese military presence, while others saw it as a skirmish and really that it was sort of restabilized. Um, However, and this is what brings us back to the issues of popular nationalism, is that these kinds of small scale skirmishes, again, harassments, sometimes outright attacks or murders of Japanese nationals in various places. Still, we're talking about human to human violence. This is not state led attacks. Were cropping up in many many different parts of the country, which is to say that although Chiang Kai-shek was not leading a massive response to Japan, this is not to say that there wasn't a growing anti-Japanese sentiment among millions of Chinese people. These were things that were impossible to keep in check, and they were beginning to crop up over and over and over again. And there was one particular outbreak of aggression in Shanghai, and in essence, looking over the entire environment ecology of Chinese nationalism and these anti-Japanese sentiment, also boycotts of Japanese goods, uh, harassment and so forth, that it was decided to mobilize. And in August of 1937, well, at the beginning of it, let's talk first about Shanghai. The initial sense here was that this was a limited conflict, largely confined to Shanghai, in which the the way one might think of it is that Japanese militarists, and now with the blessing of the Japanese state, had in essence decided upon regime change. The how what a post conflict China was going to look like has been subject of debate. Would we sponsor the development of different Manchukuo-like regions, say in the areas of Mongolia, areas of Ningxia, others? But certainly, the Chiang Kai-shek regime has demonstrated that it is no longer compatible with Japanese objectives for China. Now, the Battle of Shanghai, which is really the beginning of this conflict, it involves the Japanese Expeditionary Army entering the city, and what ensues is a much longer and much more protracted battle than anyone had expected. Um, so this is sometimes referred to as the kind of Stalingrad of the Pacific War, meaning this was street by street, building by building, room by room, and it dragged on for months. And the resistance was far fiercer than anything China was expecting. I mean, they had reason, they had really just sort of done as they pleased in the Northeast, and what they found here was something very very different. And the reason that this is important, besides that it's a almost a sign of things to come, is that the experience of the Battle of Shanghai has been pointed to as a conditioning factor for the kind of profound violence we see with the invasion and occupation of Nanjing. That Nanjing is, in a certain sense, punishment for the Battle of Shanghai, or that it is connected, that there is a pent up kind of rage that is unleashed in Nanjing after this period of prolonged battle in Shanghai. So I won't go into the Battle of Shanghai in particular, but these are the dates. It lasts much longer than Japanese military planners were expecting. Again, this was not meant to be something that was going to involve the occupation of all of China or something of this nature. It was a large scale kind of police action, uh, but it from there began to escalate. So you basically, if you can follow this map here, you see uh, how we get from Shanghai to Nanjing, and we have Nanjing in the center of the map there, and of course Nanjing at this point is the capital. The capital of China is Nanjing, and we're still we're still we are somewhere in between right now, a a story of informal empire and formal empire. So there still is at play here the possibility of a destruction of the capital and of the capital regime and of capitulation, surrender. Japan fully expects the Chiang Kai-shek regime to surrender if the capital is taken. That is not what happens. Instead, what happens is the Chinese military and the Chinese, basically the civilian government of Nanjing, abandons the city, retreats, and will form basically a wartime government in exile in the city of Wuhan, the same Wuhan of 1911 revolution, the same Wuhan of COVID. And this is not something that Japanese military planners were anticipating. So when the Japanese military enters Nanjing, unlike Shanghai, there is really no resistance. And this is just some of the imagery from Shanghai. I won't dwell on this. There is this is a war at this point still along the models of wars that we have seen already, although of course the scale of this is far larger already than anything we've seen. But the goal here is to get the elites, the Chinese government, to capitulate, to surrender. That is the game. And we also have this story of the kind of smoldering rage after the Battle of Shanghai, and we have profound and inculcated racism. And I know that's a weird thing to say when we're talking about one Asian peoples against another, but we remember, come back to our earlier discussion of a deeply entrenched idea that within the yellow race, Japan is supreme, Japanese supremacy, and the virtual subhumanity of some of the other peoples within that count as Asian, but that are not at the same kind of level of civilization as Japanese. And so it is on the march in between. In between, we have Shanghai, and then on the march to Nanjing, this is when we begin to see some of the kinds of atrocities that will be a sign of things to come. So one of the most infamous is something that's covered in the Japanese press, of these two military officers who, en route to Nanjing, engaged in a competition with one another as to which one of them could decapitate the most Chinese en route. And so this is, so we need to remember that Japan is going the route of fascism and racism, not unlike what we are going to see with Nazi Germany. Like, one could imagine a celebrated article about the extermination of Jews, or the extermination of maybe Roma, celebrated in a Nazi paper, And in this, we have this kind of, so it's, supremacy, subhumanization. And this leads up to the fall of Nanjing, which falls very quickly as compared to Shanghai because there's basically no military defense. So in December of 1937, the city falls, largely without challenge, and the civilian government and the military abandon the city, retreat. And what follows is what will later be crystallized in the term, phrase, Rape of Nanking, or the Nanking Massacre. At this point, we have wide-scale documentation again of this. Now, something that, I won't dwell on this, but it is, these strange moments in history where, if anyone has ever read this is about the story of this man, John Rabe, who's a Nazi Party leader, but he actually engages in the creation of this safety zone for the protection of Chinese nationals. So we have this bizarre story of a Nazi kind of playing this Schindler's List sort of role. Very interesting story. It's a very interesting story, and you can read it and then immediately put it aside and actually read more, delve into the kind of the central history of this. Like the only issue I have with books of this nature is that it's a way for Westerners to find like something Western in this story, when really the story, it's kind of equivalent to when people are fascinated by these American mercenary generals in the Taiping Rebellion, and it's like, just focus on the Taiping Rebellion. That's complex enough. But in any event, it is very important, and it's very true that at this time, 1937, Japan is not at war with any Western power. We are years away from, and not only years away, but there is no prospect of Pearl Harbor anywhere in the thinking at this moment. Japanese military planners do think that that a war with America is inevitable, but this is not the time for it. This is not when it's going to happen. So it is true that in 1937, 38, 39, 1940, ironically, the areas of extraterritoriality, the international concessions that are run by the French and by some Germans, the British, become safe havens for Chinese nationals who are fleeing the Chinese parts of the city and trying to get respite, because Japanese militarists, although they do make many forays into these international settlements, have to be very careful not to inadvertently kill a Frenchman or kill a Brit or kill a German or kill, they have to be very careful about that. And so these international settlements become these bizarre safe havens. The population of the international settlement just skyrockets because people are fleeing the Chinese parts of the city for their lives. So where are we then? Japan has decided on regime change. It has decided that the Chinese Nationalist Party under Chiang Kai-shek is doing nothing to keep in check anti-Japanese actions, anti-Japanese boycotts, all of these things that are threatening Japanese interests, and they have committed themselves to regime change. They think that by conquering the capital of China, this is the end of it. And instead, they find themselves in Nanjing, in Shanghai, in all of the roads leading between them. And the Chinese nationalist regime has retreated hundreds of miles into the interior. Do we chase them? Do we leave? Is this it? Is this not? And it's really at this moment when we have the full-scale mobilization. This is when no longer are we going to have a police action, and we are going to have a full-scale war. And the answer is we are going to pursue them in Wuhan. And so what will follow is Japanese military forces will work their way through hundreds of miles of Chinese territory to the city of Wuhan, the birthplace of the 1911 revolution, and they will destroy that government as well. And in fact, the Battle of Wuhan in 1938 is one of the most devastating for the Chinese nationalists. They lose most of their sort of advanced officer corps. It's it's a debilitating battle for the nationalists. And once again, Japanese military planners think this is it, and it's not. The Chinese nationalists retreat again, deeper into Chinese territory, this time all the way to, in essence, southwest China, very far away from uh, where Japanese forces are at this point. And by this point, we're talking about by the end of 1938, there is no end in sight. None. So this is the moment in which, people often use these as various points of comparison. This is the Soviet Union's Afghanistan, America's Vietnam, France's Vietnam. Arguably, this is some combination, and this is larger than all of those. This is Germany's Soviet Union, more or less. That's the kind of scale at which the only comparable scale for this. It's far larger than the Afghan War, far larger than the Vietnam War in terms of expanse, scale, and not time, but loss of life eventually. The entire nascent industrial base of China is lost. All major ports are lost. The capital is lost. All centers of finance are lost. All centers of higher education are lost. Major populace. These are the most populous parts of the country, many of them. And what you see is, on the one hand, millions upon millions of Chinese nationals now coming under Japanese occupation, direct Japanese occupation. But you also have a relatively large scale retreat of a whole manner of different institutions into the interior of China. And one that I know pretty well because of a book that I wrote about Southwest China is the decision to relocate Peking University, Fudan University, Tsinghua University, just basically every major university on the East Coast to the Southwest. And in the city of Kunming in Yunnan, 3 or 4 or 5 of the leading Chinese institutions of higher learning will form a temporary university in exile called Lianhe Daxue, sort of United University, or sort of Associated University, Southwest Associated University. And this is as if like the United States had lost the East Coast to an invasion, and MIT, Harvard, and I don't know, Princeton, like reformed in what county did I just learn existed today because of the election? Like just somewhere. And Kunming became a weird international city. Yunnan province is a landlocked province. It borders Southeast Asia. But over the course of the war, it became the center of Chinese higher education, became a really cosmopolitan city because you had people flying over the hump. You had Americans there. You had Brits there because of the Burma Road. You had many government officials there. It wasn't a government in exile there, but it was in close connection with Chongqing in Sichuan province, just one province over. So it became this strange kind of cosmopolitan city in the middle of nowhere. It was like Burning Man, but kind of like important. No offense, I've never been. I don't like being around people that much. So this is where we are in 1938. This is not what Japan thought was going to happen. That's really the point that I want to underscore here. So this is where we are. This is how we get to this dot and this dot. Chongqing and Yan'an, and that's where we are. But this brings us the question of by 1938, 39, 40 of a war without end, an increasingly desperate attempt by the Japanese military to through to do a few things. One is to start sponsoring the creation of um, occupation governments. So this is where the man Wang Jingwei comes back into play, who we met as the main competitor of Chiang Kai-shek. Well, he agrees to serve as the head of a Japanese-sponsored collaborationist Chinese government. So once again, Japan is not interested in just staying here and ruling. They want to sponsor the formation of a variety of either capitulationist governments, collaborationist governments, Manchukuo-like client states. They start to sponsor various ones. They want a terrain in what was China to be a constellation of pro-Japanese or Japanese amenable governments. And at the same time, they need to try to get the nationalists to surrender. They're becoming increasingly desperate in this. And so we see two things happen just briefly. One are just increasingly ferocious, merciless military campaigns against underground cells, basically, many of them communist, kind of operating in underground cells. And this was sort of this is where we get into asymmetric warfare and very kind of forerunner of the Vietnam War, of who are our friends, who are our enemies, and then if a village is suspected of being Chinese communist by this point in the war, of what was known as the 3-all campaign: burn all, loot all, kill all within a village that might be suspected of being harboring or themselves Chinese communists or Chinese nationalists. At the same time, Japanese military planners begin to run the numbers, and they begin to think, if this war doesn't end, we very quickly will not be able to prosecute it. Japan is not an oil-rich country. It has certain abundance of certain kinds of natural resources. It does not have others. Manchukuo is a boon for coal, especially, but they are running out of oil. They're running out of the ability to prosecute this war. And one place where there is a lot of natural resources is Southeast Asia. There is rubber, there is oil, there is petroleum, there's natural gas. There are lots and lots of things down there, but so are there a lot of Europeans and Brits and Dutch and French. And so if we are going to do this, if we are going to try to expand the theater of war in order to bring what we now think of as Southeast Asia into our control, and thereby buy ourselves natural resources we need both to prosecute this war and to cut off any lifelines that are coming in through, say, British Burma or French Indochina resupplying the Chinese nationalists. We need to cut them off, starve them, give ourselves natural resources we need. If we do this, almost inevitably, we are inviting intervention, certainly by these European powers and the United States, because we're going to have to go into the Philippines. We're going to have to go into Guam. We're going to have to just really threaten a lot of people's interests. And so if we leave the American Pacific Fleet untouched, we are at great risk. So as part and parcel to this expansion southward into the South China Sea area and Southeast Asia, we need to take out the capacity of the United States to project power, project force in the Pacific region. And that's why Midway and Guam and Pearl Harbor are part of this calculation. So the point of Pearl Harbor was to beat China. And is the simplest way to put it. The point of Pearl Harbor was to keep the United States out of a conflict long enough that they could bring the China war to an end, make it a done deal, and then place others like the United States in a position of asking itself, well, Japan just won that war. It now China surrendered. Chiang Kai-shek surrendered. It controls the place. Do we want to try to take over the Japanese empire? And that's not a simple answer. That's not a simple answer. And there's a lot of reasons to believe that maybe the decision would be made if Japan could prosecute this war to its conclusion, that this gamble may have worked in its favor. As we of course know, that is not what takes place. And I won't go into this, but by 1943, we see an unprecedented, just to the same extent that no one had ever seen the British Empire. And so we always have to remember with the Opium War, how in the world could Lin Zexu have been so stupid? He should have known. No one had seen an empire, an industrial capitalist empire with the ability to project force in so many places and so many times. No one had seen what a full-scale industrial capitalist war machine really looked like prior to 41. When the United States, at the beginning of 41, I'm sure many people in this room know this better than me, the the military capacity of the United States in 1941 versus 1943 and 44 is night and day. The United States mobilized itself as a war machine, an economic machine for the production of war materiel, of course, that the world had not seen to that point. And of course, no one could possibly have known about the development and the perfection of an entirely new mode of human destruction, which of course is atomic weaponry, the splitting of the atom and its weaponization. So we're going to come back over this, and that's not we'll revisit some of this. I know that was brisk, but the point here is from Japan's perspective, this was a war without end. It needed this war to end, and at the same and that's its main reason, its rationale for its vast expansion into the so-called Greater East Asian Co-Prosperity Sphere and its attack against the Pacific capacities of the United States, but also British, French, and many others. And but then at the same time, the world was not ready, and certainly East Asia was not ready for the precipitous end to the war. The speed. So the two things about this war that no one was prepared for was how long it would last and how fast it would end. Because this moment, this picture, is both the end of the Japanese Empire in essence, and the beginning of the Chinese Civil War. There is almost no boundary between these two conflicts. One leads into the other. And so suddenly, hundreds of thousands, millions of Japanese forces are demilitarized on the Chinese continent like that. So you have an ocean of weaponry. Who are they going to surrender? Who's going to accept the surrender of these Japanese soldiers? Whoever accepts the surrender will have those weapons. Not to mention that the Soviet Union's entering, and whatever space the Soviet Union occupies, you best believe that they are going to groom it for eventual transfer, hopefully to Chinese communists. So this is the beginning of the Civil War immediately, and no one is prepared really for it. And so this is one reason why the Civil War unfolds in the way it does, and we'll get to that next week. I'll see you all soon, and I hope you all have a good sleep. Just